you can go back and consult it later. So we have today Elizabeth Jordon, who has looked at the research on research and what it takes for policymakers to, the different ways policymakers use research. And then we have two partnership members who have used research early in the advocacy and policy process to talk about the way that they got policymakers involved. We, as I put up a notice, we would like everyone to mute your phones using *6, but you can ask questions. At the bottom of your screen on the left, you should see a chat function, and if you type in your questions there, all of the presenters will see them. We will take questions at the end of the webinar, but we will make sure that we get to all your questions. So you can write your question whenever you want. Make sure you don't forget what it was that way, and then we will answer it at the end of the webinar. So I want to start by introducing our presenters. We have Elizabeth Jordon, who is a senior policy analyst at Child Trends. She supports a variety of projects that analyze how policies can support or create barriers for vulnerable children and families. She researches policies on foster care and supports the Early Childhood Data Collaborative. She also co-leads a project designed to better understand the ways that juvenile justice judges incorporate research into their decision-making. She previously worked at the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law, and she clerked for 2 judges on child welfare calendars in the D.C. Superior Court. I've got Janice here second, although actually she'll be our last speaker. Janice Barler is a policy scientist for the University of Delaware Center for Community Research and Service, where she is the director of Kids Count in Delaware. The project, Kids Count Project in Delaware, is a collaborative effort of over 40 organizations, which is housed within the Center for Community Research and Service at the university. Before her appointment as director, Janice was the policy analyst for Kids Count in Delaware, and during her 18-year career with the University of Delaware, she has also worked in university administration and as an evaluator on a cross-college collaborative grant that analyzed a series of statewide programs aimed at preventing youth substance abuse. We also today have 2 speakers from the Maine Children's Alliance. Claire Berkowitz is the executive director of the Maine Children's Alliance, and before she took on that leadership role, she managed the Kids Count Project for over 5 years. She has also worked at Badon College and has experience working for 2 community-based organizations that serve children, youth, and families. Her colleague, Rita Furlow, is an attorney and also serves as the senior policy analyst at the Maine Children's Alliance. Rita works closely with state leaders to help make young children a top priority for policymakers. Her legislative and policy experience includes working in a congressional office, in the Maine House of Representatives, the Virginia State Senate, and as a special assistant to Maine's Attorney General. Following her graduation from law school, she focused on special education and disability law and advocated for children in private practice and as the executive director of a nonprofit advocacy group. So, thank you all very much for coming today to talk. And before we start with Elizabeth, I'm going to ask our audience to answer a survey for our speakers so that they have a little bit of a better sense of how much work you have done with policymakers and what your background is. So I'm going to give you just a moment to answer that, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, so let's see. It looks like about a third of the people on our call have been working with policymakers over 5 years, and almost we've got more information coming in. And about a quarter each have been doing it for less than 1 year or for 1 to 3 years. So our group really is a mixture of people with a lot of experience and not all that much. So now, Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can start by talking about the research on research.
Great. Well, thank you, Debbie. Thanks for hosting this webinar, and thanks to you all for joining. It's really interesting to see the group of people that we have on the call, some newbies to the policy world and some folks who've really been working on this for quite a while. So I'm hopeful that this can be useful to all of you, and I'm really curious to see what questions it sparks from you all as well. So today I am going to share some of what we've recently learned about the different ways that policy makers use research in their decision making. And in addition to that, I'm also really excited to share some of the strategies and best practices we've learned for communicating with policymakers. And all of this is really just pulled from a recent research brief that Child Trends put out around this topic. We released it back in October, really just summarizing the state of the literature that's out there. Before I dive into the actual research, I thought it might help to have a little bit of context, as to why we decided to take this journey to explore the ways that research is used by policymakers. For those of you who may not know, Child Trends is a nonprofit research shop. We focus exclusively on improving the lives and prospects of children, youth, and their families. So we love research. We're a curious group of people, and we want to make sure that the research that we do is getting into the hands of the folks who can change the lives and the outcomes of children and their families. So our initial goal as we approached this literature review was to inform our own work and our own planning. We're so fortunate to receive a grant from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to really spend some time assessing our role in this space and kind of the way that a group like Child Trends can support the work that's happening in states, the work that you all have been doing, some of you doing for years and years now. But since we're researchers at heart, our very first step was to look at what research already says about the way policymakers can use research evidence, and not just how they use it, but when is it best for them to receive it, and how can we package it in a way that's really accessible and really useful to them. As we started diving into the academic literature, we really felt the need to translate this and share it more broadly. There is a lot of academic research out there, but it's scattered in a way. Some stuff has been done internationally. Some work has been done looking at local decision makers. Some work has been done at the state level. Some work has been done at the federal level. And we wanted to take this opportunity to really catalog it and cull it and to think about what message from it we could really share with the broader community so that other research organizations and other advocates, state advocates and federal advocates who are working on children's issues would have a way to understand, really easily and accessibly how policymakers might be using research. And we also found timing-wise, it just dovetails so beautifully with some of the current policy climate. We've seen here at Child Trends, and I'm sure that all of you on the webinar have seen this as well, a real growth in what we at the federal level call evidence-based policymaking. It's really a movement. It's a way for policymakers and advocates on both sides of the aisle to find consensus. We all want to do what we know works for vulnerable children and for their families. And as excitement and interest in this way of framing research has come about, it seems like just a great time to put out a little brief like this and make sure that folks know how to get that research-based information into the hands of policymakers. So today we're just talking a little bit about the key findings that we discovered through that literature review. To kick it off, on your screens you'll see this picture of state legislators, and a big shout out to NCSL, who gathers demographics of state legislators in every state. Really nice data on who are those 7,383 state legislators. And you can see from the graphic, they're more male than female. Black and Hispanic representation in the legislature isn't representative of the entire, or of the general U.S. adult population. And we also see more baby boomers in that role of state lawmakers compared to the general U.S. population. And I think this information is really valuable to those of you who are packaging research and sharing research to policymakers, because you need to know who it is you are talking to and what will resonate with them, and you know, who these people really are as you develop and prepare to share the research on what works for children and families. And I also could not be a part of a webinar in December without at least mentioning a recent election that we had. I wanted to make sure that you were all aware of this resource. NCSL has done a tremendous job of mapping the changes across states in the 2016 election. It lets you explore both the state legislature, the governor's office, and overall state control, and the state control is what's pictured on your slide now. I'm sure that the folks on the line today really know what's happening in their states, but I think it's helpful to know where to find this information for neighboring states, or thinking strategically about partnerships you might want to form with folks in other states that might have a similar policy landscape, might be facing similar challenges, might be struggling to message things for a different audience than maybe you've messaged things for in the past. But looking at this map, I think it's also really important to note that at the state level, the 2016 election didn't really change a lot. We had 3 chambers switch from Democrat to Republican, and then 4 chambers switch from Republican to Democrat, and so not a huge shift at the state level. All right, so let's take a look at the policy process. And I would imagine that even the folks who have been working on policy issues for less than a year realize by now that the policy process is really messy. We don't go from point A to point B to point C, and we certainly don't tie it all up with a neat bow. But after reading through some of the academic literature that's out there and describing this process, we really felt that we wanted to think through a way to visually represent what this process looks like and hits on each of the really key junctures along the process. So as you'll see on your slide, first we have legislators defining a problem that needs a solution. This is when they say, you know, there's poverty is an issue in this community, or this community doesn't have access to early childhood education, or whatever the issue may be. We move to understanding really the full extent and cause of that problem. Is this, you know, there's 2 squeaky wheels who are telling us it's a problem, or is it something we are really seeing in a community or across the whole state? The next spot along this, if we look at this at least linearly, we'll see that policymakers incorporate their personal ideas and values, and that's not a surprise to any one of us. We all do that in our work, but it's an important thing to remember as we want to share research with folks, that these are people, and they come at it with their own ideas and their own values in place, and important to remember as we frame things for them that they are going to interact with it as their own person as well. Once we've moved from kind of these background, understanding the issues, understanding the depth, thinking about how we perceive it, we move into choosing a policy direction. And that's how, as policymakers, we might want to address this problem. And then we get specific, we make a plan, and then push for enactment. And this can be the juiciest, perhaps, part of it, where policymakers are encouraging one another to vote one way or another and hashing out those last-minute details on plans. And that final last stage, policy implementation, we wanted to have it in there since it's so key to the research community and the advocacy community, but really it's implementation is often where we see, at least from state legislators, them really taking a step back and it moving into the hands of the administration or into program people to actually move forward on implementation. So thinking about research use. This does seem sort of like an odd spot to start when we're talking about how policymakers use research, but it's really important to know that research can play a role in every step of this process. So defining a problem, it clearly has a space there. It can be a part of making a plan, pushing for enactment, and it's an important piece on how we frame research when we think about incorporating our personal ideas and values. So as you, as researchers and state advocates and folks who are working in the policy space, think about bringing materials to policymakers as much as you are able, identifying where your state is on this process around the specific issue can be really critical in helping you map out a policy agenda that will be the most powerful and the most impactful. So we talked about process. It's time to think about the different ways that the evidence, the research is really used by policymakers. As I just mentioned on the last slide, and as I was preparing, I kept waffling about which should come first, the ways that they use it or the process. And I stuck with this, and I'm gonna stick with it, but I may flip back to a slide or two because it's so important to remember the overlap between the ways that they use evidence and the different times in the process when they're using evidence. There's so much synergy that happens around that. So this first one that's listed in that top left-hand corner, instrumental use, there are a couple of different ways that different researchers have defined this term and defined this type of research use for policymakers. One is really using research to help a policymaker learn about a particular problem and to provide motivation to address it. So it's the research on poverty and how harmful that can be to child outcomes, that sort of motivational research. Alternatively, we can also think about instrumental use as a way of helping a policymaker learn about a particular program that might address a relevant issue. So thinking back, and here I will move back just so you can see it, thinking back to that making a plan, this instrumental use is when you think about what does the research tell me about what plan I should have in place? What do we know about what will work for children that we want to make sure is incorporated in our plan? The second one, conceptual use, and that's on the left but on that bottom row, is a research that either generally informs the policymaker on a topic or changes his or her attitudes around it. And thinking back to that process again, we see this a lot when we're defining that problem, when we're thinking about the extent of the problem and the causes, and also when we're looking at the lens of the policymaker's his own background and his own beliefs. The third use that the research identifies is the strategic or tactical use. And I know this to me was what I thought of first when I thought of research use. And that's when a policymaker will use research to further his or her own political goals. So for example, a policymaker says, I really want this policy to move into place. Look at what the research tells me about how this policy will work or how much better these things will be if you implement this policy. And a really interesting study we came across talked about how using language like that, a policymaker saying, the research says this, can be very persuasive and can be very powerful. So an important thing to remember, both as you present research to policymakers and recognize that policymakers are receiving research from those who have different political agendas than you as well, who may be framing it in a different way. So there's all sorts of ways to use information strategically, and it's important to be sensitive to what that could look like. This fourth use, process use, this is participation in research changes the way that a policymaker thinks and acts. So it may be that a policymaker learns something new about how a program is being implemented and changes a policy so that it can be implemented more robustly, more successfully. The The final use, imposed use, is when research is used to fulfill a policy requirement. And we're seeing this more and more at the federal level when federal funds are tied to a program that either meets a certain bar on the evidence continuum, or the program agrees to spend some of the federal grant money to fund further future evaluations of the program. So I do want to provide a few disclaimers before moving on around this research use. It's mushy and it's complex. I think research can be used in so many more than one ways, and I tried to have these little overlapping circles so that you could see it. It's not one or the other or the other. It's often in more than one way. That fluidity prevents us from being able to put things into real clear categories, which is frustrating as a researcher. But I think it's important to remember as you approach policymakers that things will have more than one use for them, that the information you provide them thinking that this is going to be conceptual can tomorrow be used strategically by them, and to keep that in mind as you frame your materials. And also, as a note on the research, different authors and different studies have talked about research used by policymakers in different ways and using different terms. So these resonated with us and what we know, but I do want to caveat for you all that you may hear different terms being used as you talk about this over coffee with all of your friends. And there is a lot of ongoing research around this issue. The William T. Grant Foundation has been very invested in funding research around the use of research evidence. And so don't be surprised if we have a webinar 5 years down the road and I have some different terms to throw at you all. All right, so that was a lot of abstract, mushy, not clear thinking. So in all fairness, I want to make sure I leave you with some good, concrete, clear strategies. We were really fortunate as we went through the literature to be able to pull and call out some really good, strong strategies for building connections with policymakers to help facilitate their use of research. And the first one that came across so strongly to us is that personal connections really matter. And several studies said that policymakers would rather have a personal connection than anything else. They don't want a toolkit, they don't want a brief, they don't want talking points. They want to sit down with a researcher and pick their brains. It's not always possible, as I'm sure everyone on the phone is nodding and saying that would be nice. But it's important to go into knowing that the types of things you can do when you talk one-on-one is what is of value to policymakers. The research gave us a few reasons for this. There can be dialogue about the findings, and that's just so critical. A research report can't answer your questions about what something really means. It can't ask for clarification. It can't ask for context. So just that type of interactive nature is really, really helpful to policymakers. Policymakers also, researchers, a few of the different articles that we've read talked about how policymakers are people. They like people. They're good at interacting with people. They're used to talking to people. And so it kind of lets them be on their own turf, and it makes them feel comfortable when they have someone in the room and can look at your visual cues and learn about what you're saying face-to-face to you. So diving a little bit deeper into that, we were able to look more specifically at what it is, what those key ingredients are that can make a personal meeting or a personal relationship between a researcher and a policymaker really thrive. This first one, and I think from our seat as a nonprofit research organization, this resonates loud and clear with us, is that absence of bias. Policymakers can be skeptical, and it's important that researchers are able to tell what their research says, of course, but can also explain what it isn't able to say yet. being able to honestly tell a policymaker, what we can know and what we can't know from a certain study are really important to building trust. And it lets that policymaker know that you are thinking about this holistically and you're not coming at it from a certain angle. Second, the researcher really needs to be responsive to what a policymaker needs. So the policymaker has to be able to understand what the researcher is conveying, and the researcher needs to be able to answer questions that the policymaker has that pop up. And that ties right into the third, clear communication. Those summaries, those answering questions, those clarifications, they all have to be clearly communicated using language that a layperson can understand. Part of that, which really rung true to me.
Doesn't have anything new.
Well, I think someone might not be on mute.
Like, translate from a child trend. Somebody else is supposed to be translating research for policymakers, but.
Hold on, I think someone might.
I think you're okay. I muted her.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. So part of the clear communication that really rang true for me is that when you're building a personal connection with a policymaker, you need to be bringing a broad set of knowledge. So it's not sitting down with someone and saying, I conducted this study. Let me tell you about, the tiny group of children that we looked at serving in a pre-K program, serving a very narrow population. It's being able to clearly communicate where that small study fits within the context of what the policymaker is doing. So that's understanding young children in the state, it's understanding the community that the study took place in, and it's thinking about the role of the policymaker and how this information can be useful to them, which again blends right into practical applications. We have to make sure that the research that we provide to policymakers is really usable. We can't just tell a story about research without showing the policymaker how this research can influence the way they act or the way that they, the work that they do within their role as a policymaker. He or she just doesn't have the time to really dive deeply into the research and pull those types of conclusions him or herself, and he or she doesn't really bring that expertise. Their area of expertise is really in the policy and building that, and it's up to the researcher to help draw that connection in for the policymaker. So because we know that all of us can't have personal sit-down meetings with state policymakers and organize a researcher to come in on every topic that matters to children and families, we do want to include for you all today a little checklist of strategies for producing written research that's really powerful. I think it's important to really note that written research has to stand out. So one of the studies we came across said that policymakers read about 27% of the information that came across their desks on this particular topic. So 27% read, 53% skimmed, and they never read the remaining 35%. So it's really important, to have something that looks readable, looks interesting, so they actually pick it up and start diving in, and then is concise enough to get what they need to know out very quickly. A couple of other final things to include in written materials, just to make sure that research findings point out areas of consensus and areas of disagreement, so that a policymaker knows when he or she wants to use this research, either strategically or to build consensus, he or she knows what they're getting into and they know what the opposition might sound like. It's also important to include benefits, risks, and costs, because those are the kinds of questions that they will have to answer in their role as policymakers. And finally, just to make sure that written research includes the researcher's advice or guidance on policy implications, that you're not just left with here's our 10 top findings, and the policymaker doesn't know where to go with it. So that's it for me. I'm so excited to pass the webinar off to learn more about the good stuff happening in Maine and in Delaware. And thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks, Beth. So before we turn to our Maine researchers, I'm going to ask you all to answer another question to help illuminate their presentation, and that is whether you've conducted your own research and data collection, or whether you've just been using, not just because it's important too, but as opposed to using other people's research and data as well. So I'll give you all a few moments to answer this poll, and then we'll take a look at the results, and then I'll turn it over to Claire and Rita. Okay, it looks like most people have responded, so let's take a look at the results here. And it looks like overwhelmingly most of you have conducted your own data and research collection, which is pretty exciting and particularly means you can capitalize on what Beth said about policymakers wanting to sit down and actually talk with researchers. So now our next speakers are Claire Berkowitz and Rita from the Maine Children's Alliance, and they're going to talk about a project that they did working on children's social, emotional learning and development. Claire and Rita?
Hi everyone, this is Claire, and I'm here with Rita in Maine, and we are excited to share a bit about this project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And we're really going to talk more about how we used research, and we're not going to go too deep into the weeds on the results of the research that we conducted here in Maine, but we've been working on a project to look at social emotional development of young children and how that is impacted in early care and education settings. And this came about 2 years ago. Rita and a lot of her work revolves around early childhood policy, and she talks a lot to child care providers and folks in the fields, and she was starting to hear anecdotal stories about challenging behaviors being experienced in child care settings and preschool settings, Head Starts, and she was talking about the challenging behaviors and also some kids being asked to leave by staff, and or parents deciding that the place wasn't the right fit for their child and removing them. And so through our work and our partnership that we have with the Alliance for Early Success, we decided to pull together a group of stakeholders, other child care providers, mental health advocates, mental health professionals, some legislators, and have a stakeholders meeting. And we were able to bring Sheila Smith from the National Center for Children in Poverty and Margie Wallen and Lori Cobb, both with the Ounce of Prevention. And they helped us have and start this conversation in Maine about early care expulsions in child care and preschool settings, and hearing about what was going on nationally and in states. And around that same time, it felt very serendipitous to us because the U.S. DOE and DHHS had released that joint statement on the prevention of early care expulsions, and so it felt very timely to us. And at the end of that stakeholder meeting, we realized that we needed to do some state-level research to find out what was really happening here in Maine and what the prevalence of expulsions that were happening and what those challenging behaviors looked like, and not just be working on this policy using anecdotes. So now I'll turn this over to Rita, and she'll tell you a bit more about our project.
Yeah, so after the stakeholder meetings that we had, we learned that some of our stakeholders had been in touch and talking with legislators about the meetings we held, and that a state senator had put in a bill relating to this topic. So we ended up working with her on that bill and informing her about sort of where we were in the process, that we really needed more data and more information. So we participated with her in the public hearing process on that bill, and one thing we heard loud and clear from the members of the Education Committee were they really wanted more Maine data, and we very honestly told them we didn't have it, and so ultimately this bill ended up not going forward, but instead the committee recognized that our governor at this time really was not fond of study committees and would ultimately veto the bill, but they were very interested in moving forward with this, so they asked our Maine Children's Growth Council, which is our state advisory council, to work with us and the Department of Ed and the Department of Health and Human Services to go ahead and complete that study without the bill and still report back to them. So we began that work and ended up spending the last really year and a half working on those issues, and as I said, worked a lot with the Maine Children's Growth Council. And so one of the key components of the initial phase was really the survey. And Dr. Sheila Smith and Maribel Granja at the National Center for Children in Poverty were crucial. And as Claire mentioned, our partnerships through the Alliance for Early Success were critical to us doing this work. Because we didn't have the capacity to do that, and Sheila was able to help us with that, do that survey over several months, and ended up then coming back to Maine in June to really present sort of her preliminary findings and talk more to our ad hoc committee about those preliminary findings to really help inform her so she could complete the survey.
And I'll just tell you a little bit about what the survey showed, so that you know what kind of data we were able to share with some of our legislators going forward. We had a 26.5% response rate. We sent the survey out to almost all licensed child care providers in the state, and 474 responded. And over 60% of those respondents told us that they had experienced extremely challenging behaviors in their classroom, and that interferes with children's learning and their ability to get along with others. And those behaviors included things like biting, hitting, throwing, pushing, being impulsive. 92% of the teachers reported that at least one child in their class or their family child care setting had shown challenging behaviors in the past 12 months. And on average, they reported that 5 children in their classrooms had challenging behaviors. So it was prevalent. And we also asked them about some of the adverse childhood experiences that these kids with challenging behaviors might be exhibiting, and they reported things like family health issues, mental health issues, substance abuse, domestic violence, financial hardship. And it was hard to get at the expulsion, exactly the expulsion rate, because of the way some of the questions were asked. We were trying to be careful not to alarm child care providers. And so we do know that about 8% of respondents said that parents had removed children from a classroom because they didn't meet their needs because of the behavior needs of their child. 10% of staff told parents that the child must leave because the program could not meet the child's needs. And then 15% of the time when a child was removed, it was both a parent and staff decision together. So there were some pretty profound findings in this survey that helped inform our work going forward.
And so after the survey, we then spent a big chunk of the summer working again with ounce of prevention, NCCP, and 0 to 3 on really creating these policy briefs. And our ad hoc committee determined that we really wanted to focus on 6 primary sort of subtopics relating to social emotional development. So professional development, parent engagement, mental health consultation, screening issues, suspension and expulsion policies, and early intervention services. And so we ended up setting up the policy briefs by doing, a brief introduction, looking at research-informed strategies, and then looking at examples of some of those strategies that are being used either in Maine or in other states, and then providing some recommendations, and then making sure that we also were, providing resources and references for all that material.
So once we developed that policy brief, we held a conference in September, and we sent that policy brief out in advance, so people came informed about what we were thinking about as recommendations based on the research that we had been doing. We also, and the attendees of this conference were child care providers, mental health professionals. We had some legislators, some funders, United Ways. It was a real cross-section of the folks we work with here at the Maine Children's Alliance. And Sheila Smith came back and presented her findings to the group. And we also had Dr. Walter Gilliam from Yale, and he does a lot of research around early childhood expulsions, and had done some research over 10 years ago that found that Maine had one of the highest preschool expulsion rates in the nation. And right around that same time as our conference, he had just been on NPR talking about new research that he was conducting in Connecticut, and showing how there was this effective mental health consultation program that was statewide that was showing some positive results and reducing the number of expulsions. So we really wanted him there to tell people about that there are solutions to this in states, and how we can maybe bring that, elevate that here in Maine. And so in terms of the ultimate recommendations that sort of came out of the ad hoc group, we wanted to make sure that they were supported by stakeholders, that they were research informed, that they were going to be actionable and specific, and that they were, we also found that it was important to make sure that there were some Maine success stories, even if they may have only been programs in some regional locations in a county, in a specific school, but we felt it was important to also, build on some successes that already existed in Maine. And ultimately, after going through and prioritizing all the recommendations, we really, everyone really came strongly around wanting to put forward one top recommendation, which was a statewide voluntary early childhood consultation program. And so we'll now be reporting back to the legislature with its full report, and ultimately be bringing back Dr. Smith, who's willing to come back and testify to the legislature, and then we'll be working with legislators in terms of specific legislation. So that's our story, and I'll turn it over to Janice now, I think.
That's right, Janice.
Hi, everyone. So this is Janice Barlow, and I direct a Kids Count in Delaware at the University of Delaware, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a Delaware case study, how we used Kids Count in Delaware data to make a difference when it came to infant mortality in our state. So taking you back a few years, in the 1990s, Delaware's infant mortality rate began to increase. You can see our trend line going up while the whole rest of the nation is going down. It was something that we noticed when we were putting our book together every year, and we had concerns about this. We had started talking about it a little bit, but it wasn't until 2004 that we could really get the momentum going on the issue. And so what happened was in 2004, infant mortality took center stage because when the Annie Casey Foundation released its annual data book, we were ranked dead last in the nation for this indicator. And we knew that we weren't doing great, with that trend line, but last in the nation, that was pretty dramatic. Our governor at the time shook up things a little bit by breaking Casey's press embargo. She called a press conference the day before the data book was scheduled to go out and told reporters, we have a problem. that on the next day they would see this report from the Casey Foundation in which Delaware was ranked worst in the nation for infant mortality. But she said, here's what we're going to do about it. And she laid out a plan that included the creation of an infant mortality task force, and this task force would be charged with generating specific recommendations for how to reduce the state's infant mortality rate. Now, all of this didn't happen spontaneously. You know, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't by chance. If you take a look a little bit behind the scenes, there were a lot of things going on, a lot of factors at play. Kids Count in Delaware had been pushing the media for some time to become involved with this issue. It started way before we got our last in the nation ranking, and continued through with op-eds and updates on actions that were being taken after the 2004 ranking. Kids Count wrote a white paper report that was distributed to key folks in the state. We also convened a group of stakeholders, the people in the community who knew something, were experts around infant mortality and child health, to talk about what's going on. Why are we so different than the rest of the nation? Why is our trend line increasing when our neighbors aren't? And then we took that information and we were able to feed it to the governor as she made her plan. Our real ringer, though, it came down to relationships. Our Kids Count director at the time, this was before I became director, her name was Terry Schooley, and she was also wore a legislator hat. So she was member of the House of Representatives, and she'd been working for this particular governor, with this particular governor for several years. And so it was by virtue of their relationship that she could call up the governor and say, hey, Ruth Ann, this is coming your way, and you need to be prepared. It was the trust that they had developed over that time that kind of allowed Terry to have that conversation and the governor to receive it. So one of our Kids Count in Delaware board members co-chaired the Infant Mortality Task Force. It created a 3-year plan with 20 recommendations. The governor, having already gone on record in a really big way to support the whole initiative, put $1 million of new funding into the state's fiscal year 06 budget to support some of the key recommendations. She was also very supportive of legislation that was co-sponsored by Terry, which passed both House and Senate. The first bill established the Delaware Healthy Mothers and Infants Consortium as a successor to the Infant Mortality Task Force, and the second generated funding for a comprehensive fetal infant death review board. 6 months later, Governor Minner announced a second $1 million of new funding that would be budgeted for preconception care, which was another one of the task force recommendations. By 2008, close to $6 million in brand new state funding was allocated based on recommendations of the task force. And just to put this into a little context for you, this is happening at a time when the state's budget was beginning to contract. A hiring freeze went into effect in the state during this time. Agencies statewide were being asked to give back a percentage of their funding. And as a side note, infant mortality was never this particular governor's passion. She really, really, really cared about cancer as a public health priority. She had a loved one that she lost to cancer, and so that was something that she focused on quite a bit until this whole last ranking kind of pushed her a little bit more in our direction. So on March 23rd, 2009, Kids Count in Delaware released its newest state-level fact book, and infant mortality took center stage once again. This time, it was a good reason. It was the first year since this all began where we began to see a change in the direction of the trend line. So efforts in the state had begun to reflect in the state-level indicator data. Now today, the work continues. Delaware still is above the nation. We're not doing wonderfully yet, We've got a very dramatic racial disparity as well, as you can see. We've got higher rates with infants born preterm, with mothers who had received no prenatal care, who were under 20, who didn't complete high school, and who were unmarried or were smokers. Now, the Healthy Mothers and Infants Consortium, which you'll remember is the outgrowth of the Infant Mortality Task Force, they still remain a very powerful voice and a force in the fight to lower infant mortality in Delaware. Kids Count continues to be a partner, very active in this consortium, and we continue to look at the recommendations, look at the data, and develop those relationships and talk with people who can make change and continue to push that. So that's kind of my case study of what it looked like in Delaware for you.
Thank you very much. So this is a chance now for everybody listening in to ask some questions. The way you do it is by using that chat box in the bottom left of your screen. And if you write a question there, then we'll ask one of the presenters to answer it. While we're waiting for you guys to write your questions, I want to ask both or all of Claire and Rita and Janice whether, as you listen to Elizabeth's presentation, anything jumped out at you as being particularly important when you presented your research to policymakers in your states.
This is Janice, and I think the piece that was the biggest for us is the idea that personal connections matter. That is just, if you have great data but you can't get it to the people who are making decisions, it's not helpful. It really comes down to the relationships and the networks and the trust that's been built.
Yeah, I was thinking about the personal connection piece that was talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And several of our legislators that have been interested in this project, and one who's been a real champion of it, have personal experience around family members with mental health issues and in the struggle to find services and to get the care that their child or their loved one deserves. And so I think that really helped draw them in and has kept them personally connected to this project with us.
Okay, so we have a question that's directed to Elizabeth, but I'm actually going to open it to all of the speakers. This is from Carolyn Oldershaw, and she is asking, can you share an example of when a piece of research that you thought was conceptual was instead used as a strategic tool? So let's start with Elizabeth, and then I'll invite our other speakers as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think you can use any of that conceptual research strategically. So if I meet with a policymaker and I say, look, kids in my community don't have access to high quality early care and education, that's giving my policymaker, the person I'm talking with, that information about a topic, gets him or her invested in it. My policymaker then can take it to his or hers and say, hey, friend policymaker down the street, we've got to invest more money in childcare. And policymaker friend down the street says, I don't want to do that. I got other stuff to invest in. My first policymaker can say, hey, I've got this research. It tells me that kids in my community don't have access to high quality care, and that hurts their outcomes. So it's it plays both roles depending on who's using it and how.
So Claire and Rita and Janice, do you want to add anything to that?
I would only add that I would agree with that. I mean, I can think of several instances where data, one that comes to mind is we were collecting bullying data, cyberbullying in particular, but our then Attorney General decided that he wanted to make an issue, that kind of his issue. And I don't know if there was a personal connection or a reason why, or if he just thought it would really play well, or in terms of somewhere where he could really make a difference. And so, you know, he took that and kind of made it into his issue. When we originally created the data, it was more of an education of what exactly is going on in schools and online and things like that.
Okay. Well, we also have a question again from Carolyn for Janice, and that is, can you share more about how you worked with other legislators on the research around infant mortality in addition to working with the governor? Janice?
Hello, can you hear me now? Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, great. So as I said before, Terry was she was a representative in the House, and so in addition to having that relationship with the governor where she could just call her up and say, hey, you need to deal with this, she was in Legislative Hall daily. So she brought it up at a kids caucus meeting. She developed a kids caucus, created a kids caucus, and was a co-chair of it. She brought it up in her Democratic caucus meetings. She brought legislation to the floor and advocated with her colleagues in order to. So it is a unique situation because she wore both hats. And so it just lent itself to working with other legislators because they were right there and she had easy access to them.
Okay. I'm going to flag one thing, Janice, that you did while we wait and see if anyone has one more question, and ask Claire and Rita maybe to comment on it as well. But this is something I've heard partnership members talk about a lot over the years, and that is that you didn't spring the research on the governor, that you gave her a heads up and gave her an opportunity to be collaborative and responsive. And, you know, I'm wondering if you want to say anything about that, and then Claire and Rita, I wonder if that's something you've done as well in your state.
That is just our tradition of how we work here in Delaware. We just what's the expression? You catch more flies with honey than vinegar. We just find that collaborative relationships work better, especially because it's a small state. The people that are in one office in one time eventually are going to be in another office. They don't go away. They're always here, and we want to build long-term relationships. So we don't want to be burning bridges as we go. We want to just, you know, kind of always be respectful and build that trust.
And Claire or Rita, do you want to add anything?
This is Rita in Maine, and I absolutely agree that we're also a very small state, and relationships are crucial. And so yes, working with folks at the Maine Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services has been, you know, a key part of the proposal that we've been working on, and they've been incredibly helpful and generous with their time.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers. I think what you said was really helpful, and research is so fundamental to the way that partnership members and Kids Count and FBP members do their work that I'm hoping that this will help them take their research to policymakers earlier in the process, because as you can see, Elizabeth's research shows that there's a variety of stages, not just the final stage, and doing so in a way that really helps you get the results you want. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.